survey those boundary issues before we move on to the critically important boundary issue, which is enhanced humans and maybe the issue of the interface of machines with artificial intelligence. So the way we're going to run this is I'm going to talk for a little while, then I'm going to engage Amita in a friendly conversation, then we're going to throw it open to you, and as usual we'll have a little class exercise toward the end. So where did we get to? This is a picture of a field close by my house, and here you can see a boundary. And if you're on one side of it, you get to enjoy the green grass, and if you're on the other side, you're out, right? So a lot turns on these boundaries. We've been looking at very esoteric philosophical inquiry about where thresholds are, but just to remind you, a lot turns in practice on where we define these thresholds, or if we define the thresholds. I mean, there's a school of thought against human essentialism, against the argument that we can reduce it down to one or two key criteria, but if we do, the stakes are very high for a lot of different groups. So I just thought I'd, number one, tout tourism in my country, and number two, give you a visual image of a boundary. So just to explain where we're at, and this is mostly for Amita's benefit because we've gone through this ad nauseum, we've begun with the purely empirical inquiry in biology as to who counts as a member of the species, who is human. And what we noted from that is biologists themselves do not fixate on any one or other of these criteria. Some of them are purely internal to the person, like having a brain, having a mind, having consciousness, having a rational capacity or a capacity for cognitive functioning. Some of them are more outward looking in terms of empathy toward others, an ability to enter into relationships, perhaps even an ability to assume obligations and to be trustworthy and reliable. And then a last one had to do with neither of the above, which is simply sentience within the field of the human species, being able to experience pain and pleasure. And anything beyond that is a bonus, but at least if you have that, you're recognizably part of the human species, okay? And I also told you there's a subfield within biology, human biology, on the cultural determinants of labels that biologists generate from time to time. So it's not as if biologists are making 100% claim that some of the labels that they're itemizing have 100% objective grounding in reality. They're smart enough to know they don't. So they're the empirical questions, which are buried deep and are inaccessible to lawyers, which is a great pity. That has to do with the non-interaction of our disciplines, and it kind of points interestingly toward the value of interdisciplinary study. Okay, building on that then is the normative question of who is a member of the moral community. And if you're not in, you can't win. Okay, if you're not in, by definition, you're out. Remember, we had this debate about you either have full moral status or you don't. And the idea that there are gradations of moral status doesn't sit too well with the mainstream in ethics, okay? The problem is that amongst the many criteria you could have chosen from the biological criteria, the ethicists have tended to fixate on cognitive ability as being the essence of a morally considerable person. And people who don't have that are not morally considerable, and therefore the obligations of the moral community toward them is much less, if in fact non-existent. And in fact, Jeff McMahon, a very, very famous philosopher, comes very close to saying that the killing of somebody who's an outsider, who doesn't have full moral status, is of no moral significance, or virtually no moral significance, which is frightening when you think about it, and really quite a challenge to our sensibilities. So quite why they fixed on that amongst the menu of available options is a little bit of a mystery, but the historical side of me would probably say it has everything to do with the Enlightenment. It has everything to do with the commercial societies we were developing 300 years ago. Remember Lord Mansfield, one of the great champions of purging the common law of all ethical constraints and moving toward a pure market-driven conceptualization of the common law. All of that comes together. All of that fits together and helps rationalize, if not justify, the fixation on cognition as the essence of who is morally considerable and who is not. And I'm a legal realist, right? And we believe that law is just a pale shadow of these contending forces. It has some determinative value of its own, but in fact it's really just reflecting assumptions deeply embedded in our legal, historical, political cultures. So deeply embedded we aren't even conscious of them. We don't really articulate them anymore and bubble them to the surface. So the law follows suit. The law erects basically a test of who's in and who's out. And that test is somebody who has cognitive capacity is a fully functioning human person in law, and someone who doesn't, we have to find alternative ways of dealing with them because their moral agency doesn't exist. They are not in themselves a moral agent in the world. Somebody else has to be their moral agent. Somebody else has to be their guardian angel, which is basically what guardianship is, okay? Whether full or partial guardianship. So if you're not acknowledged as a person in law, you don't get the benefit of equal recognition as a person within law, and then the full panoply of rights, privileges, and obligations that are opened up to you just don't arise, okay? And that's why we call it civil death, the civil death of the person, which, by the way, and you know this from our previous classes, has affected many different groups throughout society and still does today in some countries. If you're a woman, for example, your status in some Gulf states is questionable, to say the least, to this day. So then we looked at some conceptions on selfhood and on personhood and on moral agency from different disciplinary perspectives. And we found that what's really emerging over the years, particularly in the last 3 decades through scientific inquiry, is the realization that at one extreme, the self doesn't exist, the moral agent doesn't exist, highly corrosive insights from sociobiology. They duck and weave quite a bit and head toward that premise and then back away from it. It's not yet, I suppose, a widely accepted premise, but nevertheless I exposed you to it just to understand the influence of genetics, particularly on the makeup of the self. Remember we said that we were, or rather our gene pool was put together maybe 10,000 years ago when we were fighting the mammoths, not fighting with nuclear weapons, but definitely fighting with spears and axes, and how we're pre-programmed toward violence and aggression. And we're pre-programmed to view the other negatively. Flip it the other way around, we're pre-programmed to value those close to us the most, which explains why we save our own children rather than the nieces and nephews in a fire. I don't know, I've never been in that situation. And then this World Bank report comes along only two and a half years ago that kind of lends succor to that says most people most of the time think automatically. It's the back part of your brain, the reptilian part of your brain, that's actually engaged most of the time. Somebody comes to you, maybe from a different culture, a different country, phew, no, you're not going to engage, or perhaps you create a pathway to that person, but only on certain conditions. So the defensive nature of our makeup kicks in, and of course was highly useful to us 10,000 years ago when a stranger probably really was an enemy, okay? and so on and so forth. So the World Bank kicks in and says, first of all, most of us think automatically, not using the deliberative part of our brain. Even though we have this wonderful processing capacity, we only use it a minimum amount of time. I always think my brain needs to be upgraded, but actually I'm not really using the half of it. Second thing the World Bank says is that we think socially. We reflexively want to see our preferences valorized by those who are close to us. We think almost automatically socially. So we want to be validated and valorized, and this is what Cass Sunstein calls groupthink, that we automatically fall into that kind of category, and that perhaps explains why when you meet one group in the morning you say one thing, when you meet a different group in the afternoon you say the other thing, and you're left questioning, where's the real me, or is there a real me? And the third thing the World Bank says is that we all come to data, information, the world that confronts us right now, with baggage, with our own mental pictures. And those mental pictures are very heavily dispositive of our reactions in particular situations. And we inherit those from culture, from history. So for example, if somebody comes to you from, I don't know, Afghanistan or somewhere like that, you say, uh-oh, what am I in for here? Or if somebody comes to you from Northern Ireland, no, I much prefer to associate with people in the rest of Europe or whatever it is. So those mental images are very controlling about how we actually behave, about how we exercise our moral agency. You're kind of left wondering, what really is the role of cognition here? Is it just playing a bit part, or is it playing no part whatsoever? Now, the World Bank is very careful to say cognition exists, it functions, but what they do is they radically contextualize it, and therefore send messages to governments that if you want effective public policy to change private behavior, what you don't count on as rational behavior, what you do is you manipulate those three things, well, particularly the second two, the social context within which decisions are made. What if this group said, we are absolutely against corruption, even if we can make money out of it, right? Instead of saying, oh, well, you know, if you can get away with it, or whatever. So if you can nudge that social framing and perspective, so much the better. And also, more longer term, the mental images and the mental pictures. So we're kind of left wondering, really? Cognition? The essence of what it means to be human? These guys really didn't get it right, did they? So now we come to a real boundary issue, where we're forced, we're tested, basically. We're really asked, do we really believe cognition is the essence of personhood? Or is there an alternative basis? And disability is the first big boundary issue. And that's why we're doing it today before we move on. Of course, tomorrow we're looking at animals, which is another boundary issue before we look at the at superhumans and so forth. So this is just an image I like to put up for students. It's this dude, René Descartes, cogito ergo sum. Is there an essence and what is it? Just to summarize, from his point of view, from the Kantian point of view, it's all about rationality. It's all about cognitive capacity. That's what distinguishes us from the animal world. Question mark, I'm not so sure. That's what gives us a claim to moral considerability, and that's what makes us a person in law. So if you fail the test, you fail the test. You are almost the functional equivalent of a rock, okay? You don't have moral considerability, and you're not a candidate to be recognized as a person before the law. And basically, goodbye. It's not totally goodbye, because if it were totally goodbye, we would adopt the Nazi solution, which is simply to eliminate the individual. They thought that was a perfectly logical application of this fixation on autonomy, rationality. But you are, in a sense, our moral obligations to you are diluted very, very heavily. And therefore, your moral agency, which objectively doesn't exist because you failed the test, is placed in the hands of another. And it's not as if that other then is charged with the task of trying to spark your moral agency, or is charged with the task of trying to guess or second guess what you might have done in a particular situation given your background or something like that. It's that this person actually can do what he likes or she likes within the broad parameters of an idea of best interests. Okay, so that's the policing variable, which actually doesn't really police all that well. This book, I just thought I'd show you the front cover of this book. This is a famous book by Eva Fider-Kitay and Alicia Carlson. Well, they're the editors of the book. And they're coming from the field of ethics, not the field of law. And particularly Eva Fider-Kitay, she's world famous for taking on the mainstream in the ethics profession from the perspective of wider conceptions of moral personhood that do not pivot on notions of human cognition. Wonderful, wonderful essays in this book. It's only out about 3 years, by Wiley and Blackwell in London. Highly, highly recommend it. So just Google Eva Fider-Kitay and you'll be amazed by the breadth of her scholarship. One thing she's really interested in is not just the moral agency of the person with the disability, but the moral agency of their carers and ethics of caring, and rolling that back into the picture, which is often completely absent. She, in 2005, put together a special issue of the journal called Ethics. And the commendable thing about her is she included in the special issue people like Jeff McMahon and others who are really spokesperson for the traditional approach in ethics, which is that these people don't exist as moral persons. So you'll find really a string of absolutely fascinating articles in this, including her own, of course, at the margins of Personhood, but also Jeff McMahon's essay and others. Anita Silvers, we met Anita Silvers, very, very interesting person indeed. I just thought I'd show you that. So that's 2005 in the journal Ethics. Not sure if it's available on your databases, but if it isn't, I can maybe give you 1 or 2 articles from it. So you have Ethics. Okay, it's published by, I think it's the University of Chicago Press. Right, then out of nowhere, well, not completely, but out of nowhere comes the UN Treaty on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which Amita took part in drafting and I took part in drafting through a whole series of accidents. What was the expectation? I think the expectation was that the treaty wouldn't focus on these kind of issues, because what had been welling up to that point around the world had been the philosophy of equal opportunities, stroke non-discrimination. And it was conceptualized as a philosophy that acted as a bulldozer to break down arbitrary barriers into the life world, whether it was education or employment or social interaction or political participation or whatnot. But I sensed that pretty quickly people realized that's not enough, and that had never happened before. People always thought, oh, if we just had equality of opportunities, everything would be solved. If we just had formal non-discrimination law, everything would be solved. But it wouldn't be, because within equality theory, as you well know, a court, indeed a legislature, is enjoined to take cognizance of, to really take serious whether people are similarly situated or whether there's a material difference that justifies differential treatment, right? So we talked about this before, and how you see that material difference, let's say as a judge, isn't determined by the law. and isn't determined by equality doctrine or theory. It's really, if you want to go back to the World Bank report, it's determined by the mental images you bring to the task. It's determined by cultural understandings of those who are on the outside, not on the inside. And to you, their exclusion appears entirely natural and normal and commonsensical because that's the way it's been through time. And if we didn't take account of the material difference, we would be remiss, therefore, in not actually doing something good for you, right? So equal opportunities doesn't quite get you there, or equality thinking doesn't quite get you there, unless you adopt a very sophisticated conception of equality, which most parliaments don't and most judges don't, okay? So what you have to do is to excavate a deeper theory of the person to make him or her much more visible as a person, to close down space for governments and for courts to begin seeing material difference and then separating out people with disabilities in accordance with that material difference. So that's why Article 12 took on an almost iconic status. It was the ground in which we reconceptualized who a person was and who a person with a disability was. And it stumbled across lots of different things. I don't think we fully realized it. Probably you did, but the rest of us didn't, what we were doing. And to make a very long story short, and don't get hung up on the text, it's the ideas weaving through the text that are important. To make a very long story short, it displanted this idea that personhood pivots on cognition, right? And if it doesn't pivot on cognition, you should not test for a person's cognitive ability. And if you're not testing for a person's cognitive ability, you are ascribing to them moral considerability. You're viewing them as a moral agent, and you're viewing them, therefore, as a person in law, okay? Effectively, that's what Article 12 is doing. There's 5 subsections, but really don't get hung up on the text. Section 1 is interesting in that it asserts personhood, right? Something that had never been done in the past. It said persons with disabilities. It's already making an assumption. It isn't saying humans who happen to have a disability are persons before the law, equal persons before the law. Okay. The second one is saying that they enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others. So that's kind of drawing it out a bit. Not only are you recognizable as morally considerable, and as a legal person, you of course have all of the rights of moral agency, which is to make your own pathway in life, to make your own decisions in life, on an equal basis with others. I often think this is why states let it through, because they were coming at it from an old conception of equality, which allowed them to recognize material difference. So of course they could say, well, we still need guardianship, we still need ways of killing civilly the person, civil death, so that substitute decision making would still be permitted. So these were the weasel words, right, that made Article 12 palatable to skeptical states parties because they felt they could manipulate that one way rather than another. This is when you're dealing with the construction of treaties, these are the necessary constructive ambiguities that you need to actually get the provision across the line. So Siddharth and myself might agree on the text but have radically different understandings of what the texts mean, postponing the battle till later on. So subsection 3 or paragraph 3 is what's called the support paradigm, which kicks in when there is, let's say, frailty in decision making, and it opens up a completely different space in viewing people who hitherto failed the test and were considered non-persons, right? So the task now with respect to those former non-persons is to spark their sense of self when perhaps they don't have it. And of course, The paradigmatic case would be where they're institutionalized for 30 years, or whether their parents have such low expectations that are not allowed to socialize locally with their neighbors, with brothers and sisters, and so forth. Or if not to spark a sense of self, but perhaps just to assist them to make their own decisions for themselves, okay? So this strikes traditional states as bizarre, that you could have somebody with very severe cognitive disabilities who can make their own way in the world and can do that with assistance if it's provided appropriately. Spin it another way around. Very traditional states are very happy to innovate with support programs, but they're not happy to actually eliminate guardianship, which means they still cling to images of civil death and cognition as being the essence of what it means to be a human being, a morally considerable person with moral agency as well as a legal person. The other two subparagraphs of Article 12 deal with safeguards, with even more constructive ambiguity in here, because at first blush they seem to intimate that of course the state can impose guardianship, civilly kill a person, so long as we have certain safeguards like the person making the decisions, there's no conflict of interest, there's periodic review, blah de blah de blah de blah. That's, I guess, what the Americans would call due process protections, which is a salve to your conscience. You can close down the space, and that's all right, so long as the third party acting on my behalf acts reasonably well according to some objective standard, which was never, ever policed effectively around the world. The last bit is very interesting. It deals with money, property, and was put in, I guess, because of the widespread abuse of people's material possessions when placed in situations of vulnerability like civil death or guardianship. By the way, there's a group in Jerusalem called Personhood, which I can never pronounce properly, which is a fantastic NGO. Amita has met them, and they've put out protocols on what it means to assist a person to make financial decisions for themselves. Actually, I need that protocol as well as people with disabilities. I'm absolutely hopeless when it comes to finances. Okay, so you can almost hear the pendulum swing in Article 12. Of course, there are all these latent ambiguities, and we had to wait for them to crystallize in the jurisprudence of the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and they have quite recently, and I'll just expose you to that momentarily. So the pendulum swing is from moral inconsiderability to moral considerability, to viewing the person, even with profound intellectual disabilities, as a moral agent in their own right. Now that's important to stress those words, in their own right. It's not as if others are supplying for deficiencies. It's that now our task is to have almost a religious commitment to the view that there is a self, a moral agent, lurking behind the mask. And now our task is to find tools, new tools, that will enable us to excavate the self. One of the interesting things that's been happening in the last 5 or 6 years with pilot projects around the world is the evolution of what's called tools to interpret informal communication. That is to say, not formal communication like I'm engaging with now, but you know, grimaces of the face, how we use our eyebrows, and so on and so forth. So ending guardianship, ending civil death is the challenge, and restoring civil life. I like to put it positively. I like to talk more these days about civil life rather than civil death, because I'm clinging on to it myself, and then using the support paradigm. So I'll just a few more minutes. What do we mean by supports? I mean, this is a very interesting idea. start now with the spatial image that, sorry, what's your name? Alice has moral agency. There may be barriers around her that in orthodox terms have made her unknown and unknowable to us. But now we're searching for new techniques to try and find Alice, right? The first kind of variant is Alice may have had a really difficult and deprived life in the past. She may have come out of an institution. She may have been in there for 30 years. And so therefore, through a social inclusion strategy, we place her appropriately in a dense social network in the community, in her own home, not in her parents' home, because that's not your own home, right? And we, as it were, hope and expect that organic connectors between her and others will spark something in her. Perhaps the learned passivity that she's acquired in the institution can be lessened through time. And it's interesting, one of the evaluations of the South Australia pilot project found that the people who responded least to supported decision making were the ones who were coming from services and from institutions. So that's a long-term thing. And of course, there are dangers attached to that, but I'll come to it in a minute. And that's why I think supported decision making is connected to the broader social ecosystem. And it's connected to a much broader social inclusion strategy in the broader social ecosystem. Okay, so, and it's informal, right? Should we legislate for informal supports? Absolutely not. If you legislate for informal supports, the message you're sending is that those informal supporters, maybe your father or your mother, have a right to make a decision for you. That's what informal decision making meant in the past. That's not what we understand it to mean into the future. Into the future, it's just a conditioning element to enable your moral agency to be actually exercised. The second layer is, supports to enable decision making. Why did I put in the second there? The second really flows from the first, okay? To enable decision making, to be one of your assistants in decision making, to ensure that you focus on the right issues, you get your mind around to it. But now remember the World Bank. Most decisions are made automatically. Most decisions are made with social cues in mind, and most decisions are made with mental apparatuses to bear as well. So the emphasis here is not on cognition. It's not on, do you understand if you do this, that X, Y, and Z will happen. Like, if you had the experience of minding a baby for 3 weeks, would you actually get married? If you could factor all of that in, of course you would, because you're not calculating about the decision and so forth. So, again, fixate on our moral agency. We're trying to find ways to reveal her to the world. And maybe sometimes these are new ways, they're not old ways. And then lastly, there's this canard of co-decision making. Now, it's vexed me for years. I can't get my head around this. And the penny only dropped when I had a conversation with Amita, was it today or yesterday? Co-decision making is like we join our moral agency. It's like I give 50% of my moral agency to another person. That doesn't even happen in marriage. In marriage, you still have your own right, your own will and preference to do things for yourself, to undergo an operation, to handle your own money, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of unusual. We don't like that in our legal culture. Our legal culture hates it because before you know it, we're not only acknowledging groupthink, we're endorsing it. We're displacing the individual as the unit of moral agency in our culture. It's like saying, I've joined a cult, and therefore the cult is me and I am the cult. Who said that in the 1930s? Hitler said that in the 1930s, right? He said, I am the Volk and the Volk is me. The Volkish theory of German constitutional law, okay? It's spreading moral agency initially to a couple, then potentially to a group, then potentially to a nation. And it doesn't fit very easily, or it oughtn't to fit very easily. So, and it also gives rise to the prospect that maybe your moral agency is frail for whatever reason. It might be held frail in perpetuity. That is to say, I, the co-decision maker, have no obligation to build you up to the point that you can manifest yourself in the world. So it's problematic as a support, right? And most states are implementing it because they want to get people off the guardianship rolls. They don't think they can make it on their own. They don't think regular supported decision making will assist them, and therefore the only way of getting them over the line is to supplant their moral agency by placing it in the hands of others. That's why I'm still not sure about its place in the pantheon of supported decision making. Perhaps it's acceptable if there's a very strong obligation on me to build you up and not just temporarily make decisions with, which really means for you in the particular moment. So that's just a kind of, and maybe Amita will comment on that momentarily. Here are the risks. And states are right to say there are risks, and we have to be honest to admit what these risks are. So say Alice is coming out of an institution. To all intents and purposes, her sense of self has been so degraded that even she is not self-aware of what it is, and so on and so forth. When I wrap around her the elements that go to make up who we are, like just interacting with the shopkeeper, the local shopkeeper, and all of these social cues out of which she begins to say, hey, yeah, I want to be with this group here, and I will make decisions like that. The danger is we manufacture you, we contrive you, and that reeks of East Germany, creating socialist man, nudging, sculpting people to act one way rather than another. I would say actually that's equally the danger of big data in today's information society, but that's another day's debate, okay? So if I place you in a conservative community, the chances are you might emerge, if you emerge, hopefully you will emerge, with highly conservative values. If I place you in Antioch College in Ohio, which is famously liberal institution, chances are you won't vote for Trump, something like that. You know what I mean? So the danger is when we're intentionally placing the social cues around her, there's an ever-present danger of contriving who she is, of manufacturing the person. By the way, that's exactly what human enhancement is all about. It's all about contriving and manufacturing a new kind of person. So if we've qualms here, we may have qualms when it comes to treating the superhumans. One of the other risks is our interpretive tools. Remember I said there's a new menu of interpretive tools coming forward, how to interpret informal communication. And those of you who are legal realists will remember Carl Llewellyn in the 1930s, who said the problem with interpretation is it comes in canons of opposites. And in fact, he contrived 64 different ways of reading a case, all equally valid with radically different outcomes, okay? What he's really trying to get at is the element of choice behind the selection of an interpretive tool. So if you have two constitutional interpretive tools available as a judge, you're likely to pick the one that coincides with the result that you've already predetermined in the case. And that gives rise to so-called result-orientated jurisprudence. So the fear is that the interpreters will pick and choose from the menu of interpretive tools that which coincides with their view of what's in Alice's best interests in order to produce an outcome that suits them, not you. And may even suit the local social services agency because it costs less. And they may even begin censoring themselves because they look at what is currently available in your social structure and say, well, no, we'll have to skew her this way rather than the other way. I think it's a risk that can be mitigated for. There's a lady in Deakin University writing extremely interesting stuff on how to interpret informal communication, but at least it's on the table and we recognize it as a known risk. Another risk is conflicts between the supporters. Let's say Amita and myself are your supporter. Amita says X and I say Y. How do we handle that? Well, I would spin that by saying that's an entirely positive thing. If you're abundantly clear to the world, we wouldn't be needed. But it does place an emphasis on a relationship of trust in the circle that's surrounding you. And it probably does speak to the need for a mechanism to break the impasse, either to appeal to some sort of oversight body or for you to replace us, and so on and so forth. So I think it can be handled, but it has to be put on the table as a known risk. And the last risk, maybe there's more risks, but the last risk is that with all of the best will in the world, remember, I think automatically, I think socially, I think with a mental lens on, that I think you should be doing X rather than Y, okay? And what I'm actually doing is I'm unself-consciously interpolating my own values, my own principles, my own understanding of the world to you, on you, against you, okay? I'm not so sure that that is something that can be completely eradicated. I think it's part of the human condition. I think we do it reflexively with each other. We both are a threat and a support to each other in everyday life. I certainly sculpt my children's behavior in certain directions. I remember when they were very young, there was a jar of sweets, and they'd say, we'd love some sweets, and I'd say, I just can't open it, I wonder what's happening here. And say, okay. Of course, years later, they'd come after me, but that's another day's story. So it really points to the need for education in self-awareness, in the biases that we actually bring to this iterative process in human behavior. I'm not sure we'll 100% ever eliminate it, but where it becomes egregious, hopefully there will be some sort of window out to some sort of review process whereby we can require that the actual process be reviewed and so forth. So, okay. No, I'm not going to show you that. I want to just ask Amita to respond. And there's one question I want to put to her, which is, we've moved from, or at least ostensibly the philosophy, the reality not yet, but the philosophy has moved from civil death to civil life. In passing, it's kicked out the stilt of cognition as forming the essence of what it is to be a person. In kicking that away, do you think Article 12 or the people behind Article 12 or even yourself have a sense of what is in its place, or would you reject notions of human essentialism altogether? Hand it over to Amita.
I suppose, yes, we've kicked out cognition as essential to being human. That we have. What have we put in its place? For me, I suppose I buy the kind of, I buy the line of that if I have to define or constitute the human, I would sort of look to neediness, I would look to fragility, I would sort of say that that's, you know, like it's somewhere the sentience argument, in the sense of like you feel pain and suffering if you are the kind of vulnerability which is integral to coming into being, that you can't really sort of it's the Aristotelian notion of human neediness. For me, that is very integral, and I would sort of want to put more of my money there. And that's wherein for me support flows very naturally, and the business of being a person before the law also comes in then very naturally. I'm sort of seeing it as, if I don't, because I oust out by bringing in reason, bringing in cognition, and I say that, okay, this is absent, and hence the kind of way in which you are treated is to be different. On the other hand, if I say that all humans, and if you take the entire biological span of life, at different points of time, that whole business of neediness and fragility is very integral. And consequently, if you are to survive that fragility, or if you have to live with it, support is also integral. So I see these two tie up, and I feel that is a way more empathetic way of constituting both the human and the human community. That would be my response to. And in terms of like this business of equality before the law, or legal capacity, or personhood there, and the fact of that, yes, there's a certain kind of an attribution of ability to make decisions or make choices. What prompts it, whether it's emotion or it's reason or it's just gut, what is it that causes you to do it? I would say, as far as the law is concerned, if it wants to trade with reason, it just attributes it to all. I would prefer to deal with it as a presumption of the law, a legal fiction, which doesn't then have to be empirically validated. Constitute the human as being fragile, as being needy, as requiring other people to subsist, and on the whole business of decision making, not go into the empirical regime, but proceed. And that's the way I'm seeing it. I mean, and these are the two connections I make when I look at this 1, 2, and 3. 4, I think, is more, in 12.4, as I have said in my article too, and I have been saying it on a repeated basis, it was a trade-off. It was a trade-off between people who wanted a more liberal kind of a construction of legal capacity, and people who wanted a more protective one. And both saw something of what they wanted, and consequently felt, we'll deal with it later, we will interpret it accordingly and proceed on that basis.
So that's very interesting. And I think you were referring earlier on to some literature on fragility, vulnerability.
Who's done a large amount of writing, but amongst the things that he has put out as a counter to Descartes' whole business of that I think so I am kind of things, and that privileging that you do of reason, he has come up with this theory, and I'm drawing from him when I say that I found it extremely persuasive. His point somewhere is that you have to find a common trait across humans by which you would say this constitutes humanity. And he has chosen fragility, and he's saying fragility is something which is present in all humans at different points of time, in different stages of life, but it's common to all humans. Nobody can really say it doesn't exist. He has a second kind of reason for why he has opted for it, and his option, he says, is the reason why he has a problem with reason is that he says it is a kind of a trait which can be used for exclusion. You can sort of talk about some people who possess it and others who don't, and it's like your boundary wall at the beginning. It sort of gets on one set of people on the grassy side and the others are blocked out. And he has a problem with that. So fragility, on the other hand, he's saying, is the very reason why is the very kind of trait you employ to oust people. If you make that the inclusion criteria, then necessarily the way in which you are constituting the human, or you are visualizing or envisioning human rights, is a more inclusive strategy. So it's like, and I find it extremely persuasive as a justification for why he chooses it.
I don't need this. All along I've been wondering. Ma'am, my problem is if I use a mic, I'll start listening to my own voice.
Okay, we'll listen to you.
All along, I'm from the education background, and I'm applied linguist. For us, cognition, cognitive capability, building cognitive capabilities is central, because we see language as the constituent which enables us into a whole range of capacity building. And throughout this lecture series that I've been listening, I've been hearing you saying, why cognition? Can we do away with cognition? Why do we have to cling to cognition? And I've been asking, what else if not cognition? Because you see, the entire domain from which I come from works on that and the building of that in education. Now, what you just said about fragility, I have to thank you for bringing that in, ma'am, because I was thinking, okay, if people are finding fault with cognition, I couldn't see why they were finding fault with cognition. So that one statement that you said, we can use it as a reason to people, just exclude an entire set of people, is making sense now. So if it's begun to make sense now. I've been struggling with this for 2 days, in fact. Thank you, sir, for that.
So, but how marketable is that to governments? If you say to governments, let's just have a legal fiction, let's not empirically test it. These are guys on the ground who have real dilemmas to work with, and now you're coming forward with a very kind of academic perspective that radically pivots the system but doesn't help them, and they have to pick up the pieces.
I did a bit of a shortcut in putting that, so I'll a little bit elaborate when I made the presumption point. See, amongst the things that you find from developmental psychologists, you find from neurologists, you find in all sorts of people who are dealing with both the human brain and the human personality, that it is, opportunity is integral to development. And if you look at the way in which we have dealt with the absence of reason, also the whole phenomena of whether it is guardianship, whether it's any system by which we are providing that protection. You've been using the, like, of course you're saying that you're not very comfortable with civil death, but you're also recognizing the fact that that is exactly what we were doing, that you were protecting by ousting. My point somewhere is this, that same protection can also be extended by inclusion. And when you do it, when you give opportunity, when you say, all right, here is a person, it's like if you take the whole, the kind of agricultural analogy or metaphor, you could say there are saplings which require to be more carefully nurtured, which you put a net around it because somebody should not eat it up. Then you kind of give it water. You put it in the sun and out of the sun. You do all of those kinds of things, but at each point of time, you are saying this plant should grow. And you're saying that whatever this plant needs to grow has to be given to it. I'm kind of taking a similar sort of analogy and saying, all right, different minds require different kinds of interventions. If you are recognizing the diversity of the human mind and you're not saying that, all right, this kind can grow and the other kind can't, there is a problem for me there. And if I am going to sit and say which one can grow and which one can't, on notions of equality, I should test everybody, which is not going to happen. So then you fall back on this business of whether it is mental illness or other sorts of things. If I, on the other, because actually, Gerard, the in law, the presumption of soundness of mind is something we extend to everybody because it's really not possible otherwise to talk in terms of capacity. I am saying is, why have an exclusion clause? Why oust out? Just recognize the fact that you have to nurture everybody. You need to have different kind of intervention strategies. Don't use the law as a way of not owning to your responsibilities of various kinds. Don't use the law as a way of not giving a range of people the opportunity that they would get if you attribute capacity to them. Don't test it, but as attribute it. And then from there onwards, it's like, if you look at just one last example, if we look at the whole business of the power of attorney, the power of attorney is basically a legal artifact to permit me to take the help of someone else to do things that the other person does better than me, with me having a final veto. At any point of time, I can take it back. But it also is a major mechanism of support, especially when, for those of us who are not great financial managers, who are not great, we really don't know how to invest our resources. We are not great protectors of our resources. We need somebody else to do it for us. Now, if I take the kind of legal capacity principles we have today in the old paradigm, I cannot use the power of attorney, because the power of attorney I can use only if I have the capacity. But if you attribute the capacity, then there are, the safeguards and stuff like that, everybody needs. You have them for the so-called capable also. So those are my things. And I would say, if I have to sell it to policymakers, I would say, if you are going to have a strategy by which you can have that many participating, contributing, fully living citizens, then hopefully that's a better strategy than where you're locking up people and saying that, oh, these guys can't do.
I'm not going to ask you about shared personhood, because that's the topic of our class exercise, and I don't want you to give it away. Anybody want to join the conversation? Yeah.
It's kind of a very simplistic question. When we redefine personhood to not be based on cognition, because I've never studied the law, and law makes me anxious like all other non-law people. Yeah, so so my question is, can that argument then not be applied to people who are committing crimes also? Can they also not be understood to not be completely responsible for what they're doing? Because there are people who are whose actions are irrational. There are people who are very conscious, and there are power structures which are negative. So it's not like everybody has a willingness to do the correct thing. So what happens, and as we understand, the law is meant to protect from those people as well. So in my own mind, would it not be easier for the state to recognize that people with disabilities and people with lesser abilities are in a way their wards, they need to be taken care of, and whatever is required, just like the example of the sapling. So there is a stage of growth that it requires to be reached, and that the plant needs to grow, so whatever is required. So and that is the responsibility of the gardener. So the gardener needs to do whatever is required, and that seems to be commonsensically clear to me, but seems to be a major problem within the domain itself. So my simple query is, why is it not clear otherwise that the state needs to facilitate the development of all citizens, and why is the focus then on redefining the personhood and displacing cognition? Because I feel that there is a danger of even people committing serious crimes excusing themselves, saying that we were not completely in control because our identities are shaped by circumstances. We are not completely to be held responsible for what we did.
I'm going to get Amita to answer the substance of the question, but I would spin it the other way around, which is that if cognition is the essence of personhood, And if mens rea is the essence of criminal law, which by the way comes from the intermingling of the king's courts with the ecclesiastical courts about 400 years ago, whereby the ecclesiastical courts convinced the king's bench that criminality didn't depend on the action, it depended on the intention behind the action. So one without the other is not enough, you've got to have both. So by displacing cognition, people sense that what you're doing is you're actually not allowing people with disabilities to plead the insanity defense, which is arguably against their own interests. Okay, having said that, I'll hand it over to Mita to solve everything.
The way, Alice, the way I see your question is, you're saying, okay, this needs to be done, so what's the big deal? The big deal basically is just this, that the manner in which the law till now has constructed legal capacity, it has put reason at the center of it all. So in the presence or absence of reason, the presence or absence of being able to discern things, to be able to understand them, like to understand, say, the nature of a contract and how it is going to impact on me. So at each point of time, cognitive faculties have been privileged. And you say if you possess them, you have the capacity to do that act. If you don't possess them, you don't have the capacity. That's the manner in which the law has constructed legal capacity till before the CRPD, and in vis-a-vis international law. Even after the CRPD, that was the point which Gerard was making when he said on the ground that much change hasn't happened, is because those laws continue to hold ground, where you say that the presence or absence of reason will determine whether you can organize your life according to your own lights or not. That's the first dimension of it. And that's exactly what people with disabilities said, that if you are speaking in terms of the presence or absence of cognitive faculties of that level, that kind of judgment, then you need to ask that question from everybody. If you ask, it's like there are these, I don't know if you've seen on Facebook, there's this beautiful post which is doing the round of two young couple with Down syndrome, who wants to sort of like, they want to sort of be parents, and a lot of like barriers are being put in their way, like whether they'll be able to take care of, whether they can be good parents, whether they can't be. And their simple question is that when you wish to be parents, do we ask you? Do you go through a test? Does any, I mean, it's like, and a similar sort of things, if you were to start really testing everybody's rational faculties, do you do understand what you're doing? You don't. You operate on a presumption basis. The point that they are making is that the presumption which is available to everybody else should be available to us on an equal basis. That's the point. The point you were making in relation to criminal liability. Now what you have, a lot of people who are very alarmist about the new model of legal capacity, they say that if you're going to bring in this new model, what is land up going to happening is that the protection that you were given from criminal culpability, that will also go. So as a result of which, as a person with disability, if you do wrong, then you are going to be held criminally liable for the same, and this protection of the defense of insanity would go. That is the answer which is coming in from the disability community basically is just this, that to be, there's a difference between responsibility and culpability. One, you could be responsible for good and for bad, but doesn't mean that being responsible for something is also making you culpable. In law, we have things like, you did something wrong by mistake. You did it because, like, if I don't sort of like literally destroy this part of the building, the whole university could get burned down. So on necessity, you might do things. There are a range of ways. The point about that if I didn't really have the intention, like as I'm talking to you, if I sort of like use my hand in a manner, I'm looking at you, I'm not looking at Uma, but I hurt her. I have no intentions of doing so. So all of those kinds of things come into play. And people are saying that The defense of insanity anyway never meant that I was let out free. In fact, you locked me up and gave me a worse time than you would give if I was in fact convicted for the crime. So we want the whole package. We want you to look at culpability, in what is the appropriate way of doing it, but do not sort of like, in the name of protection.
Let me open it up to others.
Actually, I think Professor Thanda has covered the substance of it, but I was talking about this science fiction work which came out 14 years ago with Professor Quinn a few days ago, and there was a film made on it also called Minority Report. So it was based on a science fiction story by Philip K. Dick, who's written a lot, right? So the premise in the film, of course without spoilers, is that there are these three individuals who are able to predict the future involvement of other people in crime. So they're called precogs, literally, in the film. They're capable of, through their own anticipation, they can anticipate who will be involved in a crime. So relying, and the story is set in 2054 in Washington DC, and the city police is able to use the precogs to try and apprehend people who are likely to commit crime. So this is actually touching on a pretty interesting sort of debate in criminal law theory, that are we shifting our focus back to punishing the intention or the act? And if you look at the debate in Minority Report, of course it's a rhetorical claim, it's meant to create some sort of emotive response. But if you look at the way in which criminal law is shifting in the last 20 to 30 years, we have a broad range of offences where once again we are concentrating on the harmful effects and not so much the intention. So the kind of anxiety which you are raising, actually, if this direction continues for, let's say, a few more decades, I mean, the emphasis on rationality may anyway not be there in the way in which you define crime across a range of sectors, especially when it comes to economic legislation, especially when it comes to regulatory offences, where there are objectives other than deterrence also, which might actually be playing a role. So in addition to the exceptional scenarios like necessity or self-defense, you also have an underlying shift in the areas in which you are actually criminalizing conduct. And you could possibly say, you can argue it both ways, right? You could say that in some scenarios, we need to create punishments for acts where actually we are not passing moral judgment on whether or not the person intended harm or not, but the social consequences are such that we have to try and discourage this behavior from a regulatory point of view. So it's actually, there's a lot of literature on this in criminology, and in the last 20 years there's been an explosion of literature, especially when it comes to regulatory offences. So that's the other way of looking at your question.
Anybody else? I think this rhymes with what you were saying yesterday about the costs and the social implications of allowing certain patterns of behavior to occur, taking the extreme case of joining ISIS. But we could be in a very interesting transition right now, because for the first time we have the means to sculpt behavior through, for example, big data, through enhancing humans and then hacking into them and controlling what they do. So 30 years' time we may be in a totally different environment than we are now, and that really poses questions for the durability of conceptions of moral agency into the future. But enough editorializing. Anybody else want to join in? Okay, we're going to do an yeah. Yeah, okay.
No, I mean, just on the previous comment that I was making. So, of course, Minority Report is a work of fiction. But a few years ago, we had some litigation in India where the state police was using a particular test called the Brain Electrical Activation Profile Test. And it's basically an advanced form of a EEG scan, essentially where you put a probe on the head of the individual, and you show the individual picture probes or other probes which are connected to the scene of the crime. And familiarity with those probes was inferred as presumption of involvement in that particular crime. And there were actually people who were detained and put through this test, and the test itself was questioned before the courts. The courts, of course, took a sort of slightly ambiguous view that if the individual consents to the test, you can go ahead with it, but you can't compel them. But it's not something that is in the future, it's already happening. right? So the person may not have actually committed the crime at all, but familiarity with the probe through an direct or indirect route could also lead to you being the suspect and the case proceeding against you. So again, the question of cognitive skills is kind of it's unclear as to whether you're concentrating on cognitive skills or not. You could have possibly read about that crime in the newspaper. It might match the probe. It might be a subconscious memory from a dream. It may correlate to your probe. So there's lots of discussion around how you can actually use brain scan technologies to anticipate crime. And we never know, right? Under some authoritarian governments, it might actually become pretty common in the next few decades. So anyway, that's of course taking that science fiction analogy a bit too far.
I mean, just as I understood it, I thought that the Supreme Court, in fact, pronounced against it, and they sort of, because the whole Article 20 argument that they took in from that standpoint, and also from the standpoint that they looked at a large amount of literature which demonstrated that these tests were far from like reliable and consequently could not be a basis. Yeah. Right, and also they said that, you know, scientifically they have not been. I just wanted to put one last point, Gerard, before you open up your exercise. And possibly I'm taking a trifle different line from what Siddharth is taking, and possibly that may also be a generational difference, I can't say. But the way I was also seeing it is that the construction of criminal law and this whole business of the moral agent, and the fact of a, you know, like if you look at the sort of work that people have done around the sentence of death and sentencing people who were not themselves, you know, whether in a state of mental illness or kind of were hugely disturbed, to sentence them to death at a point of time when they did not really realize what was happening to them, a lot of people felt it was revulsive. It was like it is against how a civilized country should behave, that when you are punishing a person, there is a moral, there is a certain kind of a moral worth in the whole process, and if that is lost, then there is a problem. I just somewhere feel, and that maybe it's the more optimistic me, but I somewhere feel that once you bring in people with disabilities and you recognize the whole human continuum of how different people come in and how their minds are wired and how they associate things, possibly we may want to revisit, you know, the way in which criminal law has tried to control human behavior. We may want to look at the more restorative techniques. We may want, you know, instead of like putting people in and throwing away the key and not and forgetting all about reform and just say, okay, deterrence and retribution is our only concern. If we are really repulsed by the fact that we are punishing people whose minds may require more space and time, it might get us to revisit all of criminal law. And it's been my line always that disability rights are not about only people with disabilities. Disability rights is about human beings, it's about human rights, and if they are going to humanize rights for all people, then I think it's a good entry point. See, the thing is somewhere is that whilst I have an issue with the pre-selections on grounds of disability, just as I have problems on pre-selection on ground of gender, other than that, I wouldn't sort of like be speaking about. And that's more to do with the fact of that you feed into a certain way of looking at the whole notion of disability. So there I have an issue and a problem. But again, I am more on to giving people more information, giving people, like, you know, in the sense of don't let prejudice and bias be the basis of. If I put have a difficulty with the whole phenomena of abortion more from a health point of view, because I definitely don't think that abortion is the most efficient and effective way of birth control. But when you deny it to women without changing anything else in the world, then you definitely are saying, okay, you don't want to have that baby, you'll go in for the entire kind of quackery and other sorts of interventions which are not good for. But if as a state policy, which is what we have done in the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act, if as a state policy you are offering abortion as a mechanism of birth control, I have a huge problem.
Response to the Disability Convention Article 12, I really sort of love this new rhetoric that we're using, but so what you're actually doing, you're substituting the word substitute for a support paradigm, but what you sort of done is you sort of put these support givers and these caregivers under the more watchful eye of the government. Now there's pressure on the support function to sort of watch each decision they make and question it, and it's sort of a curious thing because caregivers, they don't operate in this normal social circle that we all operate in. They have an obligation towards the person that they're working with, and it sort of slants their perspective towards taking more rational decisions for them, right? So also them being the subject of competent, independent review, and you leaving it up to state parties again, which are perhaps composed of politicians who, on the sole idea that it affects their coffers, they're not too happy about diverting appropriate funding. So this is a problem I could see coming up. Moreover, what really is changed beyond the fact that you've given them legal capacity, you've given them a foundation to stand on, but despite equal opportunity laws for women and non-discrimination laws, it's still pervasive in society, so it's still there. So how do you sort of pull it out from the roots, and will this really have the effect that we wanted to? These are some questions.
Great questions, and there's no answers, at least not yet, because really the art and science of this is just in its infancy, and that's one reason why a lot of governments say, oh, let's not do anything until we get more evidence from the field, and others are saying, well, if you don't actually put in place legislation for it, you're not actually going to learn. Just two comments before we open up the exercise. I mean, it's quite ironic that we're at a moment in history where we're really beginning to understand human nature and, quote unquote, the essence, if in fact there is an essence, of what it means to be a human being. That coincides with a moment in history where we now have the means to control human nature. If any of you have looked at the debates about big data, you should, because it's all about sculpting you, sculpting your preferences. You are what you consume, and that reflects back on the construction of who you are. The other interesting button Siddharth's comment pushed in me is that at one point in time I've studied Nazi criminal law, right? What the Nazis did is they shifted from crimes of behavior, where people do things and they're morally responsible for them, to crimes of condition. So you commit a criminal offense just because of who you are, because you're Jewish, because you're disabled, because you're an alcoholic, and because you exhibit anti-social, anti-party sentiments. That's something we all want to avoid into the future, but you can kind of see it creeping back in some countries around the world. Okay, let me jump forward, and I'm going to get Amita to be the judge of this debate. I think you'll laugh when you see it. So, the government of India proposes a co-decision-making bill because it's convinced by Amita's arguments and her writings. It decides to abolish guardianship. Yay! And with respect to those who've been in guardianship, Alice, and with respect to those who are in danger of becoming into guardianship because they failed to pass the test in guardianship, which is of cognitive ability, they're going to put them into, or rather a court can put them into a co-decision-making arrangement. Both parties will be co-equal in the decision-making. So there's no pretense here that I'm trying to find Alice's will and preference. There's a 50-50 split, and of course, if in doubt, probably my will and preference will obtain. The government rejects the idea that my primary obligation should be to develop Alice to the point that we can restore her moral agency, her sense of self, and her will and preference in the world. So I'm going to do what we usually do. I'm going to divide this group. What would you like? What's your will and preference? Would you like to be the government or the opposition? Opposition, okay. And here, you just look some more, there's more gravitas to the side of the house. All right. So you're the opposition and you're the government. You take about 10 minutes to decide how you're going to defend this. I'd be obliged.